So now you can use the manual mode. You can go outside right now, if it were a little bit brighter, and you would be able to use the Sunny 16 rule and set all of these values on your camera by yourself without needing to use any of these other modes that help you dictate, or that help, or rather, I mean, it depends on how you want to say it. Some people say it helps you, some people say it dictates for you how the camera is taking the photo, and it really depends on how you're looking at it. Now, just to give you an idea, so let's say you are outside and it's nighttime and it's full moon, and that is generally about, I have notes here, 18 to 19 stops darker than the Sunny 16 rule. So rather than doing this, if you kept the ISO the same and the aperture the same, 18 to 19 stops slower is actually a shutter speed of, any guesses? No. Any other guesses? Longer. It's about 50 minutes long. So this is just another way of solidifying that one stop it's quite a bit of a change. So 18 to 19 stops doesn't sound like a lot, but all of a sudden our 1/100th of a second has turned to a 50-minute exposure to properly expose that particular photograph. So talking about the moon. Now, this has been actually a bit of an interesting debate for a long time, are the theories that the moon landings were faked. And there's a variety of reasons, ranging from, it could be plausible to downright, ridiculous. But one of the things that I think is particularly enticing to us as budding photographers is the fact that people claim that the exposure on these is wrong. And specifically what they're referencing is that if they are on the moon and taking a picture, because there's no atmosphere on the moon, or at least it's very, 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 very little, then we should be able to see stars in the background. But this becomes actually a question of exposure and doesn't actually have anything to do with the atmosphere at all. So you can imagine that I mentioned something about the Sunny 16 rule just in the last slide, where I said if you're outside and it's a bright sunny day, you have to have settings like this, which means that if we bump down the aperture a few stops, we could increase the shutter speed, and you would notice that it's a very, very fast shutter speed at pretty reasonable sensitivity and aperture value. So even if we go down 3 stops, for example, so we have, rather than f16, we go down to f11, f8, f5.6, and we increase the shutter speed by 3 stops. That means we go to 200, 400, 1/800th of a second at ISO 100 and an aperture of f5.6. You can imagine that if you're outside at night and you try to take a picture of the stars with those settings, you're not going to get a damn thing. It's going to be so black that you're not going to see anything. And that's exactly what's happening. The sun's light is so overpowering that there is just no way you're going to see these relatively minute stars that are giving off so much less light. Well, they may be giving off as much or more light, but because of the distance, it's just we are getting so much less light from those stars than from the sun that this is just not a valid excuse. And so I gotta say that, at least from this point of view, that conspiracy theory is complete bunk. It's just a complete myth, because there's no way that it's possible to happen. And in fact, if we take a look at a more modern photo of the moon taken from Japan's version of NASA, they took very high resolution photos of the moon, basically HD video and some high resolution photos of the moon. And they have one picture in particular where the Earth literally, it's an Earthrise. So as you see the horizon of the moon, and then slowly the Earth rises from it. And you can see a number of things happening here. First of all, again, there's no stars, but more importantly, the shadows given off by the sun, because the sun's light is so harsh, you can't even see any detail in the shadows. And I guarantee they were not using cheap camera equipment or anything like that. So it's not like it's not like it just wasn't capable of doing it. It's just that it's so much darker. There's so little light. There's no way that they were able to capture it. Yes. Yes, the reason that it's so directional is because there's no atmosphere, so it's not being scattered in atmospheric particles. So right now, if we go outside where there's still a little bit of sun, but it's mostly down, all the light is being scattered around in the atmosphere and reflecting off a number of things. And so it becomes a lot softer for us, especially in the very early morning or in the late evening. Even in midday, it does, in midday, the sun is shining through less atmosphere because it's more direct. It's going straight down onto the Earth's surface, basically. And that, as you know, where we get a lot of harsh light from the sun is around midday. It's just because there's not as much opportunity for it to scatter. So this is very much an exaggeration of that, where since there's no atmosphere here, the light is really just direct, and there's very few places for it to reflect. So sure, maybe some of the light is being reflected off some of the crater edges and to the rest of the crater, but it's very minimal compared to the amount of light that's just being placed from the sun. And in fact, so this is from JAXA, so Japan's Aeronautical, I forget now exactly what it stands for, but like I said, Japan's version of NASA. But if you go to this website, they have a video basically of the Earth rising over the moon, and it's incredible. So I got to say, the first few seconds is a little boring because you're just sort of just waiting for it's not like the Earth rises immediately. It takes a little bit of time, but it is actually really neat to see another point of view, just as an Earthrise, something that we've never seen. We've seen sunrise plenty of times, and we've seen, unless you're a night owl like me, you may not have seen it ever, or you've probably seen plenty of moonrises as well, but you probably have never seen an Earthrise. Okay, so exposure, this is one of those things where you have to be able to get it right, or you have to be able to control it in order to control the end result of your photographs. And as we talked about before, there's a variety of things that can go wrong when you are trying to take an exposure, when you're trying to take a photograph. And so we alluded to them earlier when we said that you can overexpose an image by 1 stop, 2 stop, many even more stops than that. So you can get typical overexposure problems such as this, where you can be trying to take a photo of a difficult situation, something like this, where you have maybe a photo of the inside of a cave, but you also have sort of direct sunlight bearing down on certain aspects of the image. And that sunlight, and this is very similar to what had just happened in that moon photo, that sunlight that's being shown on this specific area is so much brighter than the light that is inside of the cave, whether it's being emanated from a light inside of the cave or just being reflected around the atmosphere or even from the rocks, that you're going to get a problem like this. So I had a choice when taking this photo, even though I may not have known it at the time, was that I could either take the photo so that this detail over here and up top is preserved at the expense of losing the detail here to shadow, or I could have taken the photo like this and completely lost some of the detail in those very bright areas along the right side. And so this may seem like an impossible situation, but I said that we basically have a variety of ways that we can change some settings. So is there anything that I could do here to try to take a better photo without exposing or without overexposing or underexposing too much of this particular photo? Fill flash, yes. So I mentioned along with those 3 settings, one of the things that's most important is light. So you can actually change the amount of light that you have by adding more, by using a fill flash, so either using the flash that exists on top of your camera or using a separate flash unit, or you could use a variety of other ways of just trying to get more light inside here. So for example, they make these very large photographic reflectors. So if you've ever seen a video of like a professional photography shoot, they usually have these poor assistants that have to hold up these really big, basically white sheets of cloth or of paper that reflect the light either from the flash or from the sun, so that it fills portions of the image that are too dark. And so that's another thing we could do, is that I could have had somebody hold up a very large reflector and put more light in over here, or even these same reflectors can be used to remove a bit of light as well. So it might even be easier than trying to reflect additional light into the cave would be to have someone stand at the top and just hold something that would shade the whole region, so that now all of the light is much more uniform, so that I have fewer of these harsh, these hot spots, these harsh portions of light, and just a much more uniform amount of light that exists. Now there is even another method that you could do as well, and this is called bracketing. So just about every camera that's worth its salt can perform some sort of bracketing, and or you can even do this manually. And the whole point of this is that you take 3, maybe 5 exposures at different settings. So I could take one exposure where pretty much everything is underexposed except for these rocks where I can see all of the detail very well. Then I can take another exposure that's sort of like this, maybe a little bit brighter than that previous one, and so I'm starting to overexpose this region, but now I'm starting to see more of the underexposed regions from the first photo. Then finally I could take another photo still that was even brighter. So sure, I'm going to lose all of the detail over here pretty much, but then I'll be able to see all of the detail inside of this entrance to the cave. And now what you can do later on is you can go back using software and actually layer them on top of each other and only pick the well-exposed regions from each, so that you can then construct in the end from 3 original photos, one photo that has that's overall well exposed. And we will talk about how to do this in the future, and using more than 3 or 5 brackets. Some people will go crazy and use a dozen or so photos of, from a bracket like this, and it's called a high dynamic range shot, because now you're increasing the amount of visible light, or what we can see here is the dynamic range of the photo. So here this is too bright for the dynamic range, and within the cave it's too dark, but by extending it in this way, we can actually in software increase the dynamic range. And this is a very good technique and very useful, and a lot of people have used it to very good success. But I think in general what's easiest is to be able to try to modify the light at the scene if possible. So it's just easier to hold up a reflector and block some of that light, or use some fill flash and take one photo whose exposure is correct the first time, rather than having to go back and sit at your computer and work on correcting this photo. And like I said, this doesn't mean that it's an incorrect way of doing it, or that it's even bad. It just depends on what your priorities are, and even how much equipment you have and how much time you want to spend here versus at home. Yes?
If you really wanted to do that layer,
yes,
by bracketing, you'd pretty much want to use a tripod, wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
You'd want the pictures to be
yes.
identical?
That's absolutely correct. You want the pictures to be identical for all intents and purposes, except for the exposure. So you generally can't bracket when you have people in them, because the people will move even very minutely, and you'll get some sort of weirdness that exists there. You really can't handhold the camera and to be able to take a bracketed exposure, because you will move the camera very, very slightly, and it's going to be a problem to try to layer that. You'll have not only a slight movement, so maybe it's even just a few pixels off, but if you tilt the camera a little bit, it's geometrically different. You get some geometrical distortion, and that is even harder to correct, and so it just becomes quite a hassle. So if you're going to bracket, then yes, you do need at least a tripod to keep it very, very still and make sure that it can take the same photographs. And this is one reason why having the camera do the bracketing for you is generally a good idea, because then you just have to push the button once, and then the camera adjusts the settings and takes the photos 3 times in a row for you, and you don't have to touch the camera, because if you touch the camera and try to fiddle with settings, then almost certainly, unless you have this monstrous tripod, you're going to move the camera just a little bit. So okay, so this is an overexposed image. So similarly, you can have an underexposed image as well. And so this is very, very popular when you have, maybe not popular, but very common when you have a photo that is backlit, or you have something like this where you have a sky that is very, very bright, or a background that is very, very bright, and a foreground that isn't as bright. So maybe the sun just isn't shining on the horizon here, or on the ground that exists right here, and it's just very, very difficult to do it. So in this case, this is a bit harder of a situation, because whereas in this previous photo, this is sort of a tangible, or it's just a manageable amount of space. You could have one reflector, and you could really help decrease the amount of light that exists here. But when you're talking about an entire scene like this, fill flash isn't going to help you very much. It's not going to be enough to illuminate this entire scene, and so you're even more restricted in what you can do. So generally here, your options are pretty much overexposing the sky, or using brackets, or bracketed exposure, or some measure or something like that, because it's going to be a lot more difficult to block out light from the sky, or add light to this entire scene that exists here. But this actually brings us to a really, really good point, in that there are good and bad times of day to take photos, and at least in terms of how easy it is. So dawn and dusk, you pretty much can't go wrong with photos taken at dawn and dusk, because the light is not only very soft, but it's very diffuse, and it's also very warm that's coming from the sun. So it's not harsh light. So if you take a photo in midday, for example, you can take a good photo, of course, but the light is much more harsh, so that you get very harsh shadows, just as we can see back here. The light is very harsh. We can get some harsh shadows. We can get some areas that are very difficult to expose properly, or even just little tiny areas within the photo that are difficult to expose properly. But if the same photo was taken at dawn or at dusk, when the light is much more diffuse, I may have less light to work with, but still it's much easier to take a better picture. And during the day, if you have to take a photo during a specific time of day, then what you can really hope for is an overcast day, because an overcast day means pretty much the same thing. It's going to diffuse the light quite a bit. You're not going to get the very harsh shadows from direct sunlight. You'll be able to take a much better picture that doesn't have any harsh shadows. So if we go back here, for example, this was taken pretty much midday, or at least mid-afternoon, but there's no harsh shadows, and that's just because I got lucky with the weather. So it was a nice day, but it was just overcast enough that it diffused the light, and it got rid of a lot of these shadows. And if the same photo had been taken when it wasn't overcast, I guarantee that it just would not be very interesting, especially if the sun is not optimally placed. So maybe it's behind the players, for example, then I get very backlit situation, and it just becomes much more difficult. So we really are, as photographers, at mercy to the weather and to the time of day in order to get a very, very good photo, unless you have tons and tons of money and you can light up this whole thing like a Christmas tree. Then you can get around it. So you either have to be lucky or have lots of money. And so I guess both doesn't hurt, right? So each of these photos, by themselves, they're pretty uninteresting, but they're useful to show you as candidates for under and overexposure. But where things can really go wrong, and it always pains me to show people that I've actually taken a photo like this, is something like this, where you can get both underexposure and overexposure in the same embarrassing image. So in this case, for example, the sky is so overexposed, you can see nothing there, even though there were some clouds. And the bridge is so underexposed that you really can't see any of the detail here. And at the time, I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome, because there were clouds and all this stuff. Took the photo, I looked at it, and I got in my car and I drove away. I was like, forget it. There's no way. It's just so hard to take a photo like this, and I frankly was not being patient enough. I didn't want to wait. I don't even know. I mean, it looks like the sun is relatively low, but it's probably a few hours before sunset still when you would actually be able to get a pretty decent photo. But in this case, you'd have to do some pretty crazy bracketing. So you'd have to do a lot of brackets in order to try to get well-exposed bridge and well-exposed sky, and then you'd have to stitch it in software later. But the other problem with bracketing is that if you do too wide of a bracket, in other words, if you change the exposure values too much, it's very easy to make it obvious that you've manipulated the image. It's very easy to make it look unnatural and to make the light look sort of crazy. Like, if this photo had turned out well, or if I had manipulated this photo so that it did look passable in terms of the exposure, and I showed it to you, it would likely look unnatural, and you may not know what about it looks unnatural, but we just have this sort of sense because of our experience with seeing the world in general of how things should look. And while this is a bit exaggerated to us, if it was absolutely perfect, then something would look wrong about it. So you do have to be careful about manipulating these things in that way as well. So, but you can actually use under and overexposure to your benefit as well. So sometimes you actually want to intentionally underexpose something or intentionally overexpose something so that you completely get rid of some uninteresting details. So for example, if you want to take a photo of something with a completely solid background, then what you want to do is completely underexpose it or completely overexpose it so that it really overwhelms. And if you take a look at this photo on a computer screen, and it's more difficult to see here, you'll notice that this actually isn't a perfectly underexposed photo. It's easy to make it in Photoshop, but there's a little bit of light that exists right here that's just outside of the bottle. And this sort of photo is actually not that difficult to take. It might take you some time, but you don't need a lot of equipment. Really, all you need is something to take a picture of, a desk lamp, and some creativity. So in this case, really all you have to do is make your room, or you can make a little corner of your apartment or your home into like some sort of a home studio. And if you just make that room very, very dark, you can use one lamp or maybe two lamps and just shine some light on an object and try to get this sort of result. Especially if you understand, like you do now, these various exposure settings, you'll know that one of the things that you can do to take a photo like this is, well, if I don't have a lot of light, but this subject isn't moving, I can use a very, very long shutter speed, so several seconds, for example. But being that it's a product shot, I don't want it to be very noisy, so I want to decrease the ISO as much as possible. And now, since I want to focus just on this whiskey bottle and not on, frankly, the black shirt that exists behind it, you can use a relatively low F number so that you get only the whiskey bottle in focus, and then everything else behind it sort of blurs into the background, which helps reduce the amount of texture that exists within it. So yes, like I said, all you really need is something to stand it up on and a black shirt. And if you drape that black shirt sufficiently far away, then you will be able to get a shot like this, which by itself, isn't perfect, but it's a very good start into a very professional looking photograph for sort of a product shot. And if you sell things on eBay or even on Craigslist, just spending a little bit of time to do something like this will really enhance the marketing of your own image. So after this, I realized that I should probably also take this photo on a white background as well. So I moved the black shirt and I put a white shirt there instead. And you have to mess with the light a little bit, because in order to overexpose something intentionally, you have to have a lot more light on that than on the subject itself. So whereas in this previous photo, the lamp was positioned very carefully so that it would only illuminate sort of the left side of this whiskey bottle. And by the way, if you use some white sheet of paper, tape it together and make sort of a large poster-sized sheet of paper, you can use that pretty effectively as a reflector. So if you have a lamp shining on this side and then a white piece of paper on this side, you can reflect some of the light back so that you don't get harsh shadows again. You sort of diffuse the light a little bit that way. So now you can also illuminate this side a little bit with having a little bit of emphasis on a particular side for light. But as long as you're careful not to illuminate the shirt itself, then you won't get it in the frame. And you may have to touch it up a little bit in software, but that's probably okay. And in this case, this one is a little bit more difficult because you have to illuminate the white shirt completely. It has to be really, really, really bright when compared to the subject or the object that you're trying to take a photo of in order for it to come out well. And this one was a bit harder because I didn't have enough lamps to make the white shirt look completely white. You could still see like some folds or just some places where the light didn't completely illuminate it. But in this case, it is easier to take a bracketed exposure. I'm not sure that even I did that in this case, but it is one option available to you, is that you could take a bracketed exposure of something like this and reposition the light in the different areas, so that you could, for example, if you put the light behind the shirt and illuminate it from behind, then you're guaranteed to get very backlit scene, and that's one way that you'll be able to really overpower the white of the shirt or the paper that you have compared to the subject itself, then you can completely overpower just a specific portion of that and then just take multiple photos after moving the lamp a certain amount and stitch it back together a little bit later. So these are just some techniques that you can use to really help enhance the look of your own photos without really needing a lot of additional equipment. You can do this pretty cheaply. You can go to Home Depot and just buy some inexpensive halogen lights, for example, which are really, really bright. And yes, they get very, very hot quickly. So you have to have a pretty well ventilated room. Otherwise, you're going to get a little warm and sweaty. But just by having some of these lights, you can take some very good photos without really even needing an SLR. Because remember, a compact digital camera may not have the best high ISO performance. But when you give any modern camera just lots and lots of light to work with and a long enough shutter speed with which to work at, then you can really take high quality photos, even with very small compact digital cameras. They just love light. So just if you feed them lots of light by basically flooding your apartment with enough lights to light up Fenway on when there's a game, then you will make a very good photo, and you can use your knowledge now of these settings to your advantage to try to figure out what is best. And you'll notice that in this case, even though this looks very bright, this exposure was taken at 15 seconds. So it was one lamp, like I said, and really in order to make it look very bright and very white like it is, you have to just capture lots and lots and lots of light in order to do it. Okay. So that's it for today. And next time we're going to talk about metering. So how do your cameras actually figure out how to do this stuff for you? And we'll talk also a little bit about flash photography. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week.